sweaters. Thank you. So it's really good to see all of you. And Jeffrey, thank you again for this really marvelous opportunity. Let me begin by introducing me. I am a Kaplanian grandson, or grand student, as it were. Very quickly, I was raised in Southern California in a conservative synagogue. My parents were socialist Zionists who at one point made Aliyah to Israel, built the kibbutz, and then during a political fight on the kibbutz, as those days had, were thrown off the kibbutz, came back to America, and decided to raise us as Jews in the only way they knew how to do in America. They joined a conservative synagogue, kept a kosher home, made Shabbos on Friday night, and kept all the holidays. But the core of our Jewish life was a sense of affiliation with the Jewish people. Jewish peoplehood was the idiom of our home life and the life of our synagogue. So when I began reading Kaplan, first in high school and then in college, I felt very much at home. It was, as they say in the Talmud, pshita. This was obvious to me because this was the idiom in which I was raised. This was the idiom of my Jewish life. When I came to rabbinical school at JTS after some years in LA and years in New York, in Israel rather, at JTS, I took a job as the director of high school programs at the SAJ. And at the same time, my rabbinic internship was with Alan Miller, who was the rabbi of the SAJ, and SAJ became our synagogue. One of these days, Jeffrey, if I could, I suggest that you do a seminar on the history of the SAJ, because the development of that congregation and that community is part of the remarkable development of Kaplanian ideas in the world. Alan, as many of you know, was a classically trained psychoanalyst and spent every morning doing psychoanalysis up in his office, and then in the evenings would play rabbi for the synagogue. And it was terribly appropriate because he was struggling with his two fathers. He was struggling with the father he grew up with, who was a great Orthodox rabbi in London, and struggling with Mordecai Kaplan. And we were witness to that struggle. And living in the SAJ, and living is what we did because we were there almost every day teaching and meeting and working with the community and absorbing the environment of that community. I came out of rabbinical school and began working, as Stephen said, in Dallas, came to LA. And in 1993, my teacher, Harold Schulweis, invited me to come and to work with him as an assistant rabbi. And we worked together until his death in 2014. Harold Schulweis, born in the Bronx, educated in SAR at Salanter Yeshiva, went to Yeshiva College in 1940, majored in philosophy, studied with the Littman, who was his philosophy professor. And then when he graduated in 1945, wasn't sure what he wanted to do with his life. Half of his class was going on for smicha at YU. Others were going on to graduate school in other fields. And Harold simply didn't know where he wanted to be. And then came a newspaper article that he read. A group of Orthodox rabbis met in the lobby of the McAlpin Hotel in New York City to burn Mordecai Kaplan's Haggadah. And this was right after the Shoah. This is like months after the end of the Second World War, when burning books, as you know, was the sort of thing to do. And that Jews would be burning a book by a rabbi. And the end of the article, I've actually found the article in the New York Times when I wrote Harold's biography. The end of the article includes some of Kaplan's observations. And one of his observations was that this actually represented moral progress because during the Reformation, the Catholic Church was burning heretics. At least now we're just burning their books. And Schulweis thought if any guy could, as we would say, could antagonize the Orthodox community to such an extent to cause them to burn his book, that this is a guy that he wanted to know. So Schulweis went down to JTS and interviewed with Kaplan and decided that this is the man he wanted to learn with. And that's what brought Harold Schulweis to the Jewish Theological Seminary and, frankly, to the Congregational Rabbinate. Because much like Alan Miller, Schulweis had two great sort of father figures. One was Mordecai Kaplan, and the other was his philosophy professor, Sidney Hook at NYU. And both of them had been trained by John Dewey at Columbia University, and both were Jewish, but they had very divergent ideas of where Judaism took them in modernity. Schulweis studied with Kaplan. His first pulpit was in the Bronx, and then he came to Oakland, California, to Beth Abraham. And he was sent to Oakland for a very simple reason. The seminary people wanted to get him as far away from New York as possible. And about as far away as you can go is Bay Area. And he spent 18 years in Oakland, and then came down to Southern California to work at Valley Beth Shalom. Schulweis always considered himself a student of Kaplan. He revered Kaplan, but he differed from Kaplan in some very significant ways. And he always maintained that he had adopted Kaplan's methods, but not Kaplan's conclusions. And while other people would have called him a Reconstructionist, and many people did call Valley Beth Shalom, our synagogue, a Reconstructionist congregation, it was never formally affiliated. And Schulweis never called himself a Reconstructionist. He didn't like labels at all. But it's important to recognize where Schulweis differed from Kaplan. I'll take another moment just to do this, if it's okay. The first thing that Schulweis differed from Kaplan is very early in his career. Schulweis recognized that the Kaplanian Copernican revolution of making Jewish peoplehood the core of our identity, rather than Torah, the beliefs or the truths of Jewish life, or halacha, the behaviors of Jewish life, that making peoplehood the core of our identity came with a danger. And the danger was that when peoplehood becomes the core of identity and nothing else attaches itself to that, then we end up with a kind of sentimental ethnicity. We end up with a very shallow Judaism of bagels and lox and Yiddish phrases and fiddler on the roof. That's the Kaplanian nightmare. And that's the kind of Jews that Schulweis was meeting in California when he came here to be a congregational rabbi. People who maintained that their Jewishness was involved in these sort of ethnic affectations without a core of moral truth.
And
Eddie, so very early,
we will hear more from you about how Schulweis tried to move that forward and how you inherited that and did some of the fine work at Valley Beth Shalom that we'll hear about, and we'll hear again about a critique. For now, I thank you for that. That puts us ahead of the game. We wanted to hear that. The other person casting a shadow in a very positive way, legacy and memory, is Rabbi Abe Winokur, who was the first person I ever met who talked to me about Kaplan and reconstructing Judaism. And he happens to be the father of Rabbi Avi Winokur. So I invited Avi to share a few words about the influence of Kaplan on his father that we'll later hear about in the enactment of that at Kehillat Israel in a different generation. Avi?
Well, thank you, Jeffrey, and it's good to be here with all of you. What a great idea to be at a Kaplan Center talking about Kaplan. What a thought, Kaplan at the Kaplan Center. And I also learned a lot from Rabbi Feinstein about Harold Schulweis, who I knew not well, but I knew somewhat. The one thing I will tell you about Harold Schulweis is when I heard him speak once, I realized that if he were reading a phone book, he could have you in tears. He was that great a speaker. He was really amazing. So my father also was raised quite Orthodox in Brooklyn. His father taught yeshiva at Chaim Berlin, where my father was also a student, and then he went to Torah Vodaas and also to Yitzchak Elchanan, which is the yeshiva of YU, of Yeshiva University. At the age of 16, he rebelled. He realized he didn't believe any of that, and he was in trouble. He was in trouble because he knew he was supposed to become a rabbi, and he only knew of one rabbinate, and that was the Orthodox rabbinate. In his community, JTS was called the Jewish Theological Cemetery, where they buried Judaism. That's how it was literally known among his peers. So he didn't know what to do. He went to CCNY, and to move it quickly ahead, he heard about this guy named Kaplan, and he went to the Teachers Institute and he basically had Judaism was essentially saved for him at that point. He became totally enamored with the teachings of Rabbi Kaplan and became one of his earliest students. He accounts among his contemporaries, Ira Eisenstein and Jack Cohen. Those are the sort of the people that he hung out with. He was a chaplain in the Second World War. When he came back, he said to them, "Get me to California. It's warm there. I don't have to live in a tenement, and I don't have to freeze. Get me a job in California." So they got him a couple of different jobs. And then there's a group of weirdo, strange folks in a place called Pacific Palisades, which was basically didn't even, I can see Amy laughing, almost really didn't exist. There were no freeways. There was nothing there. It was just, there was nothing there except maybe 3 or 4 or 5 Jews. So they said, you know, we heard about this guy named Kaplan. We're really interested in him. Do you have anybody at all who has any interest in this guy, Kaplan? And of course, they found my father. So for my father, Mordecai Kaplan was the answer to being an American Jew. Was the answer to being an American Jew. And when my father started out, we never had it. I mean, we're talking 1950s, all right? We never had a conservative prayer book. We never had any prayer book except for a Reconstructionist prayer book. I didn't even know that most Jews didn't reject the chosen. I didn't even know there was something named the chosen people. That's how much my father was into it. From my father, I learned that you never said Asher Bachabanu. Why? Because how did I learn it? Because we never said it. I didn't even know it existed. I had no idea that that's what the tradition said in this home where my father kept kosher. We had a kosher home. We kept Shabbat. We did everything that you would expect a traditional Jew to do, except for one thing. We didn't believe most of traditional Judaism. My father loved traditional Judaism. This is a problem. So I would say a couple of things. In the interest of time, I'm going to say just a few things. Number one, living in two civilizations was for my father so obvious that he didn't even talk about it very much. It was just, that's what it was. It was like a duh. We live in two civilizations. Obviously, early in my life, in the 50s and 60s, there was not the kind of fragmentation we have now. The issue of multiple civilizations was not what he worried about. His main things that really, really happened, really influenced him on, and really were his guiding lights, was anti-supernaturalism. He simply had no truck for it whatsoever, and he had no patience for it. He couldn't understand why anybody would ever even believe that. He knew that people did, but had no interest in it. And the other one was, we were not the chosen people. We never were the chosen people. When we said we were the chosen people, we weren't the chosen people. We understand why we said it, but we never were, we never are, and we never will be. And the vocation of Judaism is unbelievably important. It is absolutely critical to not only to Judaism, but in his view, to the world. Finally, I want to say just a couple more things. One is that when my father spoke about Mordecai Kaplan in one of the times that I was home before I went to rabbinical school while I was practicing law, he described Kaplan very enthusiastically as, quote, a God-intoxicated man. A God-intoxicated man. He didn't talk to him about as a modern, he talked about him as a modernist, but as a God-intoxicated man, he loved that phrase. And he felt like that people who didn't think that Reconstructionist Judaism had a place for God were interpreting it in ways that made them feel comfortable because they didn't have a place for God. From his perspective, Reconstructionist Judaism was filled with God all the time and never stopped. That was his Reconstructionism. He was devoted to the Kaplanian ideal. I was raised on the original Haggadah. This is what Kaplan was to him. The part of him that was not Kaplanian was Hasidic. He had a Hasidic background, and Nigunim were the other part. So it was really balancing those two things. The only other thing I want to say is that he brought Kaplan to the West Coast. And in doing that, he founded Kehillat Israel. He was the founding rabbi of Kehillat Israel back in the early 1950s. And so it's so delightful to be here with Rabbi Amy Bernstein from Kehillat Israel, which is sort of one of I guess my home synagogue away from home, if I ever get out there again, which I hope to do. So I'm delighted to be part of this and to just be able to introduce a little bit about who my father was and why he is important when we're speaking about Reconstructionist Judaism on the West Coast. And again, thank you all so much. It's so great to see so many people I know and to see so many new people as well introduce my father, Rabbi Abraham Winokur, Zichrono Livracha, to all of you. Thank you.
Avi, thank you so much. So now, 40 years after Kaplan's death, 90 years after the publication of Judaism as a Civilization, I'm going to put two questions to Amy and Ed, and you'll see they're rather the flip side of one another. First, I want to ask them, in what ways has Kaplan been a reliable and creative guide to the kind of community you've been trying to build? I'm going to turn first to Amy for her comments, and then Ed, and we'll give you a chance to respond to one another. And please do put questions in the chat room. Our board member, Caitlin Hayes, our Balat Tshuva, our She'elah, our master of questions, will be going through those and taking a few of them to share back and to ask Ed and Amy to respond to. So Amy, you have the first go at this.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks everyone for taking time out of your Sunday to join us and engage in this conversation. It's so great to see so many incredibly talented, learned, committed folks. We're running a bit behind, so I'll try to be quick and concise. And thinking about how Kaplan has served this congregation, again, which is the largest Reconstructionist synagogue. I first have to say that Rabbi Abraham Winokur of blessed memory, and Rabbi Stephen Carr Rubin, who was the senior rabbi before me here, are really the ones responsible for creating the kind of community and the kind of priorities that have continued to allow this community to flourish. So everything I'm about to say was really, I stand on the shoulders of people who did a lot of work to build this community into the one that has these priorities. So some of the priorities that I think Kehillat Israel has that I think have helped us be so successful, especially at a time when synagogues are shrinking. A lot of synagogues are merging, at least out here on the West Coast. We're flourishing. And so I think part of what Kaplan and the movement that he helped found gives us is the insistence on the lay professional partnership and really bringing that forward. Stephen Carr Rubin was very serious about educating the board and educating lay leaders about the critical importance of the lay professional partnership, that the senior rabbi is not the authority on things. The senior rabbi is the facilitator and teacher for the Jewish community that rabbi serves. That was a different model, right? That was a different example and remains a different example if you compare how I'm treated as the rabbi here and how it's understood that I relate to the community. It's different than other places. Technically, legally, I'm the CEO. But really, I'm understood to be the facilitator of people's Jewish life who choose to be a part of this community. So in places where there was a lot of reflected glory from the amazing orator that the rabbi is or was, that is not how the congregation takes pride in their rabbi in the Reconstructionist model. It's that their rabbi is an amazing teacher and is an inspiring teacher. That doesn't mean they can't be a great speaker, but there's this sense of reflected glory in certain kinds of cultures created in different Jewish communities that is just antithetical to how Stephen Carr Rubin and some other folks understood what Kaplan was saying about the role of the rabbi. That also then focuses the work of the rabbi on connecting to the people. If you're going to teach and you're going to reach people and inspire them, then it takes a certain kind of personality to be successful in that role. And so one of the things people always say about KI when they come here, they have no idea what Reconstructionism is. A lot of them come here because they hear about it from their friends. A lot of people come here because it's Temple Beth nearest. Like there's lots of things that bring people here. But one of the first things they say is how warm and welcoming KI feels to them. And that is another part of Kaplan, I believe, and of Reconstructionism that makes many Reconstructionist synagogues so immediately welcoming, is that there is this focus on connection. There's this focus on community, the focus on peoplehood and on belonging ahead of believing or behaving, with all of the attendant dangers of that. That really creates a certain kind of atmosphere, at least here at KI, and it was so at the congregation that brought me to Reconstructionism in Atlanta, Georgia, congregation Beit Chavirim. So like, this is something I have found in Reconstructionist communities, is that the focus on peoplehood and on belonging immediately creates an environment where people are welcoming of anyone who walks in the door. And this has remained the case for us as the face of Judaism and Jews has continued to evolve and change, thank God. KI remains really, really welcoming to anyone who walks in the door. I came out as a lesbian at 16. Reconstructionist Judaism is what brought me back to Judaism. I grew up in a very traditional Judaism in a private Jewish day school and yeshiva high school, loved the tradition, and was really struggling at coming out at 16, like Avi spoke about his father. And Reconstructionist Judaism saved my relationship to Judaism as well, and I believe in some ways saved my life. And that's to say that I was welcomed right away as a lesbian, as a feminist, right away. There was no question about, did I have to park part of myself at the door to belong in a Reconstructionist community? That continues to be the case. I'm the senior rabbi for, the largest Reconstructionist synagogue. To make a lesbian their senior rabbi was a bold move. But that truly is them putting their money where their mouth is. And we continue to do that with LGBTQIA people, with Jews of color, with always, we've done it with intermarried families. Like, it's definitive about who we are. And I believe that's right from Kaplan and right from this idea that belonging comes before anything else. There's always been a proud celebration of voices from the margins. And that was Kaplan from the get-go, right? Whether it's the bat mitzvah of his daughter, all of the ways that women's voices and now lots of other voices that have been marginalized in the past have been welcome, and they've been front and center of Reconstructionist liturgical writing, of poetry, of philosophy, of all of those things. And so for me, the Kaplanian ideal also of evolution, that we are an evolving religious civilization, is critical. That the evolution of our tradition is not only a responsibility, it's also the best part of it, right? And that we are honest about what's always happened. We've always evolved. That's how we're still here, right? After the fall of the temple, we should have been gone. Once we were exiled and the temple was destroyed, we should have been gone. And the reason we aren't is because, right, we leaned into what was going on somewhere else and had this radical transformation of moving from, the biblical cult practice to rabbinic Judaism, the beginnings of rabbinic Judaism. That was a bold move. And Ed speaks so beautifully and just so inspirationally about that move. That was a radical move, but that's why we're still here. So we're just honest when we say evolving religious civilization. We've always evolved. And for me, it's exciting to be able to say that from the pulpit, to be able to say, this is the founder of our movement. This is what he taught, and this is what he lived, and this is what he believed. And this is how we continue to stay relevant, and how we stay exciting and interesting to ourselves and to each other, and relevant to the world, and having something to say at that table. And so for me, that is one of the things that really draws people here and keeps them here, is that they understand themselves to be part of a project where you don't have to be learned to be taken seriously as somebody who can shape the Jewish present and the Jewish future. Reconstructionism really empowers, I think, the Jew in the pew. So of course we have our scholars. Of course, we all look to them for guidance. And actually later, when we're talking about some things that I'm concerned about, one of them is is wanting more of Reconstructionist leadership and thought and writing and guidance. But so we do look, of course, to the most brilliant and talented and seriously engaged among us. But Reconstructionist Judaism takes great pride. And Kaplan, I think one of the bravest things about Kaplan that I admire so much is that he trusted the Jewish people. He didn't worry if there was going to be a tree in the living room in December at some point, and we call it the Hanukkah tree. He didn't freak out about that. And for a guy from Orthodox praxis who continued to practice Orthodox, ritual all his whole life, he was not worried. He trusted the Jewish people. If it's someday we have a tree and we put it in the living room and it's all about Hanukkah and all about hope and all about life and all about blah, 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 he was okay with that. If that's what the Jewish people decide is relevant and important and exciting and something that helps them find meaning and create moments of connection and of existential hope and challenge and meeting the challenges of being human, he trusted the Jewish people. I struggle to do that often. I struggle to trust humanity a lot of times right now. I'm not going to lie. But I look to Kaplan, who, from what I understand, was a pretty cranky guy. Like, he was not a happy optimist, Kaplan. And if you read his diaries, you really see the angst and, the existential worry that Kaplan had. And going to this point of the danger of, sentimental ethnicity without any core moral truth about it, Kaplan was desperately worried about that as well. He just felt this was the best answer and that he trusted the Jewish people to figure it out. So I'll stop there. And
well, you've given us much to think about, and we're going to turn to Ed and ask him the same question. What have you found reliable and creative about Kaplan as a guide to the communities you've been creating?
So in 1954, on the occasion of the 300th anniversary of American Judaism, the journal Judaism, which I don't think exists anymore, but once upon a time it was a pretty substantial journal, published a sort of overview of American Judaism. And they asked Harold Schulweis, my teacher, who was then a 31-year-old brand new rabbi, to pen the article on Reconstructionism. And he wrote a thing. It was on the 20th anniversary of the publication of Judaism and Civilization. So he wrote, the article is called "The Temper of Reconstructionism," and he begins by saying there is no philosophy of Reconstructionism. It's not it can't be pinned down into a certain philosophical point of view. It's an attitude. And I'm going to speak about that in a minute. I think Amy's done a beautiful job in articulating that. So I'm going to repeat some of the things that she said and some of the things that Rabbi Avi just spoke about. That attitude is what kept Harold Schulweis Jewish. I mean, without that attitude, without Kaplan's courage, his ability to ask every kind of question that needed to be asked, and to approach Judaism with the full power of his rationality and sensibility, Harold Schulweis would never have stayed Jewish, would never have been a rabbi. He would have gone off to be a philosophy professor somewhere. And frankly, I feel the same way about me. I would never have been a rabbi had someone told me that I wasn't allowed to ask certain questions, wasn't allowed to question certain authorities, wasn't allowed to broach certain topics, which they did at JTS, which is one of the reasons I found a retreat at the SAJ every Shabbos morning. And so it's the temper of Reconstructionism. And the first point I would say is this ability to ask the questions and the bold courage to do so and not be afraid of what answers we might find. To approach Torah, to approach the Jewish people, to approach Jewish culture with the full power of our sensibility. That's the first piece. The second piece is the pragmatism, that the answers we look at are not going to be metaphysically true. The question is, what do they do for us? How do they create a certain kind of life, a certain way of being in the world? Kaplan took it from Dewey's pragmatism. Again, Rabbi Schulweis, my teacher, he talked about, and he used a word that nobody understood, but it's a brilliant philosophy. It's basically teleological. Telos means an end of something, the end of a process. So the question is, teleologically, what does a Jewish idea do? When we talk about halacha, we talk about Jewish law. What kind of human being does Jewish law shape? Talk about ritual. What kind of human moral character does a certain ritual or a certain holiday or a certain practice shape? What kind of community does it shape? Where does it take us? This is a question that wasn't being asked in the Jewish world until Kaplan put it in front of us, and my teacher Schulweis took it farther. And it's the way that I evaluate halacha and the way that I evaluate Jewish practice as well. And the third point, and with this I'll finish, Jeffrey, so you don't have to worry. The third point is I want to reiterate what Amy said so very, very beautifully. That what Kaplan taught us is that the full cultural expression of the Jewish people is sacred. That certainly its religious texts are sacred. Certainly Talmud, Torah. Kaplan, Kaplan earned his PhD by translating Mesilot Yesharim, the great Musar text, right? I mean, certainly the religious aspects of Jewish life are sacred, but so are all the other aspects. And that there is deep meaning and value to be found in the full expression of the Jewish people. And therefore, it is the job of leaders of the community to encourage that expression, to encourage the creation of new Jewish music and new Jewish writing and new Jewish drama and new Jewish thinking in every facet of its expression, and to see all of that as something sacred within the context of the Jewish people's being in the world. That openness to the full expression of the Jewish people gave us such a more rich Jewish life in these generations than we would have had if we would have stuck to the very narrow Dalit Amos of halacha.
Ed and Amy, thank you both. In a few minutes, we're going to turn this on its head. We're going to say, Hareza Meshubach, it's great that Kaplan gave us all these insights, all these directions. Here's how we've worked on them. We're going to ask ourselves whether they're still powerful and applicable in 2024, and in what ways we might need to be rethinking that legacy. But before we do, I'm going to encourage people to, again, put your questions into chat. We'll have a brief interlude in a while. So if you have questions for Rabbis Bernstein or Feinstein, put them into chat. And our brief interlude, while you have a time to put the questions in, Caitlin has a time to pull out a couple, we won't get all, is to invite Rabbis Bernstein and Feinstein to take a look at what Rabbi Feinstein says is flourishing, multidimensional Jewish life. We have, for the past year, been asking ourselves, how are we doing with this vision sketched out in Judaism as a civilization? And I'm going to ask our able administrator, Sharon Zuther, to pull up a document that gives us the 5 things that Kaplan said we should measure the success of the Kaplanian program by. And they are right here. They are that we encourage an appreciation of Hebrew language and literature. We boost participation in the life of the synagogue and community. I've paraphrased some of these. We've put Jewish values and ethics into action. We've crafted models of living creatively in both Jewish and a second civilization. And we've enriched Jewish living through the arts. I asked Amy and Ed to think a bit about which of these has your congregation done the best with and why. What is it about Jewish life today in the 21st century that allows us to do so well in that area? And again, Hareza Meshubach, we want to underscore the successes before we turn to the challenges. So I will go back to Amy, and Amy asked if you could comment on where you think Kehilat Israel, or before that, Duluth, had its greatest successes in regard to this Kaplanian vision, and why.
I think in both places I've been, the life of the synagogue and participating in the life of the synagogue and the community was really a place that Kaplanian Judaism was successful. It really is about community. People right now are lonelier than ever. They are isolated. People feel like they are looking for conversations of meaning, and they're looking for connections that are beyond consumption. And it's not easy to find. So there's a lot out there, and there's a lot of ways to be inundated with a lot of stuff, but there's not a lot of ways to have real connections. And so I think it's one of the things we continue to do really, really well. It's a challenge. I'm not saying we've figured it out. It's getting to be more of a challenge. How do we bring people in and have them have real connections? People don't talk to people they don't know at Oneg. Like, it just doesn't happen. So we're always struggling to do it better, but I think it's one of the ways we've done it really well. And to appreciate Hebrew, I think that is something that we do well in both of those places. People really appreciate having access to a different language. We know that we see the world differently when we speak a different language. It isn't just about translating one concept into different sounds that means exactly the same thing. And I think that's one of the things that Reconstructionism has always taken super seriously among very liberal Jews who, even, as we've talked about, don't have necessarily praxis at the center. They don't necessarily observe so much. For them, even, Hebrew is a way of expressing our understandings of the world that are countercultural to a lot of, I would say, the industrial world and the West. And are really old and are really proven in the sense that they've lasted over so many generations as guiding principles and guiding ways of talking about things. So Hebrew, I think, in the appreciation of Hebrew and the leaning into it and where we can has really made both the synagogues that I've been a part of, those communities richer. Here at KI, we're in Hollywood. So we have a lot of folks who are involved in creating all of the art or a lot of the art that we consume, right, on the big screen, on our small screens. And so I have found that there's just a huge amount of creative energy that Reconstructionism really celebrates as an important expression, an important, often spiritual expression, and that's worked really, really well out here in California.
Thank you, Amy. I often point out to educators and rabbis when we explore this vision that Kaplan said, appreciate the Hebrew language, not use or master. It creates a different frame. Ed, in your part of the world, different section of Los Angeles, where would you say you've had the greatest success vis-a-vis Kaplan's 5 goals?
I'm going to question the question, Jeffrey. I'm going to make you angry with me again.
You haven't succeeded yet, but go ahead.
I'm trying really hard.
Okay.
The reason why the synagogue was called the Society for the Advancement of Judaism and was placed on West 86th Street at Central Park West was because around the block was the Society for the Advancement of Ethical Culture that was founded by Felix Adler, whose father was the biggest reform rabbi in New York City. And Adler went to City College, got a PhD in philosophy, and decided to strip Judaism of everything that was, well, Jewish, and give us simply the moral core of ethical monotheism with nothing else. And Kaplan said that's missing something. And he was trying to speak to a generation, that second generation of American Jews. They call them the all-rightniks, the ones that were trying so hard to fit into American life that they'd given up so much of their Judaism and living with this terrible ambivalence, right? I am the child of that generation. I'm the third generation. And basically, the image is simple. In 1964, April 1964, Look magazine, which at the time was the second most popular news magazine in America after Life magazine, Look magazine publishes an article called The Vanishing American Jew. And Thomas Newman, who was the senior editor, gathered all the extant demographic data and said, look, we're going into the third generation American Jewish life. Ethnic groups in America last 1, 2, 3 generations, and then they disappear. There's no Italian people living in Little Italy anymore, and very few Chinese people living in Chinatown. And he says, now that we're entering, American Judaism's entering its 3rd generation, by 1980, there'll be very few Jews in America, and by the turn of the millennium, there'll be none. Now, that's sociology. That's Hanson's law. Hanson was a sociologist who studied Swedish immigrants in Minnesota. And sure enough, in 3 generations, there are no Swedish people living in Minnesota. Whatever's left of ethnic culture is kitsch. Well, here's the irony. You know, Look magazine is gone and we're here. The simple fact that Amy and I are here, that Stephen is here, that we can have this conversation, that God, so many people have gathered on a frozen Sunday morning to talk about Mordecai Kaplan's philosophy and to celebrate the gifts that he brought the Jewish spirit. The fact that right now, there's about 100 little teeny kids running around the campus of my synagogue, and half of them have Hebrew names. Just the fact that we're here is an expression of the success of the Kaplanian vision. Because without that vision, as Amy said so beautifully, without a deep commitment to Jewish peoplehood and trusting the Jewish people to create a community that is self-sustaining, we wouldn't be here at all. Now, at the same time, we all have to acknowledge there's a great spiritual and demographic crisis that this community is undergoing. You can't ignore that. You can't ignore the disaffiliation and the alienation. However, the odd thing is, and we all have to acknowledge this too, is that ironically, we're having this conversation after October 7th, because since October 7th, there's been a sort of reawakening in my community. I'm sure Amy's had the same experience of people who call me and say, I never knew I was this Jewish, but I can't sleep, right? So tell me what I do with this. Tell me who I am. Yesterday in the Torah, we read Parsha Shmot, which Moses says to God, Mi anochi, who am I? Who am I to go do this? And people are telling me the same thing. Who am I that I'm so exercised, so anxious, so committed suddenly to things I never knew I was so connected to and committed to? What Kaplan was able to express in very easy, pragmatic, philosophical, Columbia University language was this deep spiritual connection, this deep mystical mystical was a word he would never use, but a deep connection of Jews to Judaism and to the Jewish people. And the fact that it's still alive today, and it's come alive at this moment of catastrophe, I think is the greatest testimony to his success and to all of our success. And going forward, these 5 things are certainly part of the program. And there are other things we'll have to add as we get farther into our conversation.
Okay, and we will hear that. Amy, do you simply want to say amen to Ed's comments, or do you want to add something so he had a chance to respond to you?
Yep. No, I think amen's good.
Okay, amen works. While we encourage Caitlin to go through, I think there have been several questions, pull out one, I'm going to ask Sheridan again to bring back that document. Because I think you might find it informative and interesting to know that a year ago, when we first were exploring this whole notion of living in 2 civilizations and this chapter from Judaism as a civilization, Sharon, if you can go down to the second part of the document, the next page, you will see that when we ask people, where have we done the best? The same question, essentially, I put to Amy and Ed. No one thought, so Amy, I love your response, actually. Maybe we're doing better with Hebrew, especially appreciation, than we thought. 17% of folks thought, informal poll, by the way, but the people who were joined it, 17% thought we did best with boosting participation. 42% thought that we really did very well, best with putting Jewish values and ethics into action, tikkun olam. 33% crafting creative models of living in 2 civilizations, multiple civilizations, and 8% around the Jewish living, enriching Jewish living through the arts. So clearly, in the end, we want to do well in all these areas, and we look at it as a precious Yerusha, a precious inheritance to give us this vision, and we keep working with it, and we'll revisit this a little later in the webinar as well. Sharon, you can take that down. Thank you. You've already done that. And Caitlin, is there one or two questions at this point that you'd like to put to Rabbis Feinstein and Bernstein on behalf of the Kahal?
Sure. So one of them is actually a question that we've gotten at a number of webinars, and I think potentially Rabbi Feinstein might be able to answer this in a more eloquent way than others have attempted in the past, which is that there's a question about what is the difference between the Jewish renewal movement, so Reb Zalman's movement that has a lot of overlap with Reconstructing Judaism, and Kaplan's Reconstructing Judaism. Where do we see the differences? Where do we see the overlap? Because apparently the questioner asks, after reading Judaism as a civilization, they have a clearer sense of how the roots of Reconstructionism differ from the Reform and liberal Judaism as a whole, but they want to know a bit more about how this differs from Jewish renewal and Reb Zalman's origins.
I think one could have a really fun afternoon considering Reb Zalman and Rabbi Kaplan in the same sort of moment. Because you got Mordecai Kaplan on the one hand, who comes from good Litvak stock, and is so entranced by American pragmatism, by John Dewey, by this notion, by science, how science has changed the way we see the universe. You have Rabbi Kaplan, for whom the word spirituality or the word mysticism were derogatory words. You would try to, his idea was to sweep away all of the mystical superstition from Jewish life, much like his Litvak ancestors tried to sweep away the Hasidic community. And give us a rational, scientifically legitimate Judaism. And then you have Reb Zalman, for whom mysticism, spirituality, religious experience, it's deeply Hasidic, the deeply Hasidic temperament of Jewish renewal versus the deeply Litvak and scientific temperament of Reconstructionism. There's two very different flavors of Jewish life. What binds them together is a common idea that we're not done evolving, that Judaism isn't finished, and that the creative process by which each generation reappropriates Judaism, reinterprets it. Kaplan called it transvaluation. If you read the first chapter of Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion, which to my money is his best book, that transvaluation, which re-energizes Jewish ideas, re-energizes Jewish ritual, they both embrace that idea. They just do it in very different ways, responding to two very different intellectual worlds and two very different intellectual temperaments. If you're the kind of Jew who wants everything to make sense, wants everything to be conform with your rationality, who doesn't understand any of this meditation stuff or mystical stuff, experiential stuff, is very, Schulweis, my teacher, for example, was very, very suspicious of religious experience. He was very worried about that kind of stuff because God knows where it could lead. Then Kaplan's your guy, right? If on the other hand, if you have visions, if you're a kind of Jew for whom imagination, enchantment, mysticism, religious experience, meditation, these kinds of things really captures your heart, then Jewish renewal, Rab Zalman, is your guy. But both of them would be very comfortable with each other in understanding that this is exactly the task of the generation, and that we're a stronger Jewish people to have both flavors of Jewish life presented to us in this moment of our lives. Amy, do you want to add something?
I would just say that I see now that they are just like how different we used to be from Reform. We're not so different anymore. And I feel the same about renewal. It depends what renewal community you're talking about and what Reconstructionist community you're talking about, or Kaplan, Kaplan informed community. It doesn't have to be affiliated. I'm just saying that we're becoming more and more similar. I teach meditation every Friday. We sit every Friday. I'm a graduate of the IJS program. I'm going to their retreat in a month. So I feel like there's less. I think you're right about the origins and what kind of, Jew would have been drawn to each before. But now I think people don't know when they come here, they don't know we're not Reform. They have no idea what makes us different from a Reform synagogue or a renewal synagogue. And so I think more and more we're seeing the blending of different kinds of liberal Judaism.
I think Ed's point, and Amy seconds this, is that it may be a matter of style rather than substance. And B'Shem Mel Scalt, who's, I don't believe, on this webinar, maybe the first one he's ever missed, there is a deeply mystical side of Kaplan. And it's just the categories we use and the words we use. And if you dig enough into his diaries, you see someone, as I think was mentioned before by Avi, who is like Spinoza, God intoxicated, but he just has a different understanding of God. I wonder, Caitlin, is there perhaps one more question before we turn this whole enterprise on its head?
Sure. So a question from Bob Olesh is similarly with Rabbi Feinstein's comment about the notion of two different flavors of Judaism being beneficial for the Jewish world in Reb Zalman and Kaplan's view, is Mr. Olesh has this concern that since the number of Jewish people in the world is quite small and that there are many Jewish denominations, that this is splitting the small amount of Jewish people further. Would either Rabbi Feinstein or Rabbi Amy like to talk about this?
I can't believe I'm going to do this publicly, but I'm deeply concerned about denominationalism. I'm deeply concerned about how many seminaries we have in liberal Judaism. I'm deeply concerned about, yes, and Kaplan, frankly, was very concerned about, dividing the Jewish people. He didn't want to form a movement. It was his students who pushed him to form a movement and leave the, JTS and the conservative movement. He had that concern as well. And so I think now we're living in a time of so many identities. We're living with identity politics in a way that is really complicated and is complicating for us. I have deep concerns about denominationalism. And frankly, I think we need to get our act together as liberal Jews, and we need to figure out how to work together. I think we need to have more Jewish institutions working together to really have American liberal Judaism flourish, because there is so much illiberalism on the left now that we need to pull together and figure out ways that we can consolidate and still maintain the amazing breadth of different ways of doing Jewish and thinking Jewish and being Jewish. I'm not saying we should back off that at all, but I think we can do that better together in fewer institutions. And I think, what affiliation we have with which denomination, I think those days are over. There's a lot of folks who don't want to go there, and I understand why. But I think the days of denominations are over, and we are looking at what I hope is an emerging American liberal Judaism that can have some more teeth when we figure out how to come together.
A little later, I might ask you what would be Kaplanian about that emerging liberal Judaism. But for now, I want to turn back to Ed and see if you have a response.
I will second Amy's impulse. I think that there will always be a vast multiplicity of Judaisms celebrated here in diaspora and in Israel. And Harezim Mishubach, I think that's great, because the more expressions of Jewish life that we can conceive and dream and envision and then invent and then embrace, the more opportunities we have for people of different temperaments and different understandings of the world to come close to us and find true meaning and true community. The deeper question is, how do you create an institutional structure around that? Right? Once upon a time, we had department stores. Remember, Sears Roebuck was the biggest department store in America, right? Once upon a time, when you went to the movies, they played a movie, right? Then someone came up with the bright idea of dividing the movie theater into 28 little theaters, and you can watch 25 different movies. Right. Once upon a time, they divided up the store into tiny boutiques, and you had a shopping mall. We haven't done the same thing to American Jewish institutions yet. We haven't said, let's create a large institutional home for multiple communities, because the institutional home can embrace multiple ideologies. And frankly, the proximity in the same building, in the same institutional structure, would be good for us. We will learn who we are. We will learn what we share and where we differ, and we'll learn how to live together. It's a big thing for Jews, right? So to see seminaries come together and train rabbis of different denominations, I think would be a wonderful move. To see synagogues embrace multiple communities would be a wonderful move. And to see large community institutions, remember Kaplan's idea was Kehillah. Kaplan was one of the organizers of the New York Kehillah, a large institutional structure. You join the Kehillah, and then your membership would allow you in any synagogue you wanted to go to. What an amazing idea. That large institutional structure, which provides stability and efficiency and financial wherewithal to allow multiple communities to flourish, is a model we haven't had the courage to put forward yet.
There's a comment in the chat room that just came through, Caitlin, you may have seen it as well.
Yeah, about Kaplan's JCC.
Yeah, about, well, go ahead. Why don't you share what the comment was?
Yeah, it was just asking, wasn't this the goal of Kaplan's JCC? And
Kaplan's JCC was to be more than a synagogue. That's the idea. The idea was that every expression of the Jewish people, in fact, beyond Jewish expressions, Jews playing basketball, right? Every expression of the Jewish people should be embraced by an institution. And so for a while, synagogue centers became the thing. And it was a very interesting conversation between those who were for it and those who were against it. But the idea of a broad, open institution was Kaplan's idea.
So thank you. It certainly was. I want to return now for a second kind of question to Amy and Ed. I want to return to a comment that Ed made about Kaplan's indebtedness to John Dewey for his philosophy of Reconstructionism. And Dewey was very clear, I think we want to honor him here, that when we reconstruct, when we evaluate, we do two things. One is, we say, as Ed and I have both said, Harezim Mishubach. What have we done well? Why don't we let that sink in, soak it in, and appreciate our successes? But Dewey was clear there was a second dimension to evaluation, which is to take a critical edge and say, what aren't we doing so well? Or more optimistically, what might we be doing better? So, my dear companions, Ed and Amy, I would like to ask you to think out loud about where it is in 2024 you think that we either need to augment, supplement Kaplan's vision, or even more strongly, perhaps, challenge or overturn aspects of that vision as we keep the legacy alive. So I think we're back to Amy, and then Ed, I hope you want to respond to this question. I think it's important.
So I think when I said that Kaplan trusted the Jewish people, he really did in terms of reconstructing, right, the foundations of our tradition into what it would look like in his case, modern times, modern America. I think what I struggle with now and Ed and I talked about this, is I struggle with what does it mean when what Jews are getting is reconstructed Judaism, that what they're getting is a Judaism that's been reconstructed already, and they're kind of digesting something that's pre-digested. And in order to reconstruct creatively and well, you have to have the knowledge of the foundation. You have to have a knowledge of the component parts that you want to now put together in a different way to reconstruct. And I'm very concerned about a Judaism and a Jewish people that has less and less attention span and time and sometimes interest in learning those foundational components of what Judaism, Jewish life, Jewish civilization, Jewish thought is. And so who's reconstructing? So if we're talking about, because that's, the movement, this brilliant move to being a verb, reconstructing Judaism, like who's reconstructing Judaism? So I have some concerns about that. When we talk about the lay professional partnership and how important that is to, I believe, a flourishing Kaplanian based community, I start to worry a little bit about what do we do with lay leaders who don't come to shul? We have lots of lay leaders who don't participate in Tikkun Olam. They don't participate in Torah study. They don't participate in Shabbat services. They don't participate in Sukkot. They don't participate in a lot of aspects of the Jewish part of Jewish communal life. So I'm concerned about who's doing the reconstructing. When we talk about a lay professional partnership, I'm concerned about a lay leadership that isn't necessarily fluent at all in or isn't engaged in learning and exploring Jewish ideas and the ways that we live out our lives Jewishly. I'm concerned, as I said earlier, about I wonder who's writing the next opus. So we're talking 90 years after Judaism as a civilization. Who's writing now? You don't even need to call it Reconstructionist, but Michael Strassfeld's writing, thank God. He's writing, but who's
Michael's on the call. Yeah.
Right. And Michael Strassfeld's going to come to our community and talk about the new book that he's published, which is a really important book. And so I have serious concerns about who's leading the thought and driving the thought for us who are looking for that inspiration to then pass on, right? Who's challenging us as the fluent Jewish leaders of our time? Who's inspiring, challenging, pushing us? I'm very concerned about that. I'm concerned that we haven't had another major publication like Judaism as a Civilization. And I'm not saying it's going to happen a lot or often. I'm not saying that. But I am concerned that there's not enough. We're not doing enough to get our philosophers writing and teaching. So I also feel like with denominationalism in decline, how will we carry Reconstructionist ideals and ideas forward? Like where will that show up as we have less and less focus on the teachings that created these denominations? And I'm not saying we shouldn't move away from that. I'm not. I'm saying where does Kaplan's ideas and ideals, get discussed in a time where people have less and less bandwidth and less attention for anything other than consumerism? I'm very concerned about that. The rate of change is freaking people out existentially. People are flipped out. They are absolutely exhausted. You look at the young people right now, they are trying to figure out how they will ever afford a house. They can't afford Pacific Palisades. These young people are so stressed out, and the rate of change is happening at like exponentially faster rates. It's not just that things are changing, it's that the rate of change is so quick that I worry and wonder about where is the time to reflect, where is there room and space for them to reflect on what they want in terms of the Jewish meaning of their American lives, the American influence on their Jewish lives. I'm very concerned about that. I'm concerned about the illiberalism that's happening on the left, cancel culture, because I'm concerned. One of the things that I take such great pride in being a Kaplanian, and I'm a holy roller Kaplanian, unlike some of my Reconstructionist colleagues out there.
No
But
one on this call. Go ahead.
one of the things I'm seriously concerned about is, where is the boldness of a Kaplan and his students to challenge, the norms of even their own communities? Where's the ability to, and the courage and the gumption and the chutzpah to do that, the holy chutzpah to do that in a time of cancel culture? The illiberalism that is happening on the left and in the liberal world, including the liberal Jewish world. I got called out at a Reconstructionist convention while I'm leading services, like in this way that was so disrespectful and so angry and so disgusting. And it's becoming the norm that people feel like they can call folks out and cancel people in ways that is really distressing to me. And I'm wondering, where with that happening more and more on the left, where are we going to have the ability to really debate ideas and really discuss and really dig in and really come at things from different perspectives, so that we do evolve in a way that is thoughtful and forward thinking and inspiring and full of energy? And I'm very, very worried about that in the liberal Jewish world. So and I'll stop after this. We talk about, walking in two civilizations. I talk about that all the time, about we walk clearly and firmly in two civilizations. What does it mean when we're now walking in so many identities that the two civilizational approach just doesn't have much heft, because people don't think of themselves necessarily as Jewish Americans. Right now, we have so many, or American Jews, whichever. We have so many folks who are now living into so many different identities and are part of so many different identifying communities, that I'm a little bit concerned about what that means for the thickness of their Jewish identity, and sometimes, frankly, the thickness of their American identity.
Well, I think we could, like the rabbis pursuing the meaning of the Haggadah, stay till midnight. You've raised some very deep, rich, important things that I hope will echo beyond this webinar, Amy. So thank you, and want to turn it back to Ed. What do you lose sleep about if you want to see the Kaplanian agenda flourish in Jewish life in 2024?
Well, first of all, what I want to say is I want to take what Amy just did and spend the afternoon going through each of those questions, because I think each of those questions is so core and so heartfelt. So thank you so very much for sharing them with us. I'll just give one basic idea. Again, my teacher, Harold Schulweis, who revered Kaplan and was Kaplan's student his entire life. In 1994, Schulweis published his theology. It's a collection of his essays and sermons gathered into a book called For Those Who Can't Believe. And he in the book, he addresses a sort of imaginary interlocutor named David, a young person who comes to the rabbi and says, listen, I just can't believe in all the stuff that I learned in Hebrew school, but I want to stay Jewish. Give me a way to do it. And for the next 13 chapters, Schulweis lays out prayer, revelation, miracles, God, the problem of evil, the place of Israel, the place of ritual, all of the great questions of theology, and in good, beautiful Schulweis prose. But at the end of the book, the last chapter of the book, he does something very strange. He says, after I've presented all this to David, the imaginary interlocutor, David tells me, all that's fine, Rabbi, but that's not really authentic. And Schulweis confesses that what David finds intellectually acceptable, he finds spiritually inauthentic. And what David finds spiritually authentic, he finds intellectually irrelevant or illegitimate. And Schulweis stops at this point and throws his hands up and says, this is because he was hypnotized as a kid and I can't help him. For a guy who writes a book For Those Who Can't Believe, and then at the end of the book confesses that he hasn't convinced the guy to believe. That's a pretty startling revelation. And I meditated on that. I thought about that an awful lot when I read the book. I meditated on with him. And I think the difference is because there was a generational shift. And the generational shift was between modernity and postmodernity, between second and third generation American Judaism and fourth and fifth American Judaism. First of all, the modernity, Rabbi Schulweis, like Kaplan, was a pure modernist. His idea was take tradition and shake out all the stuff that isn't rational, because I want to believe consistently in what I believe in. The anti-supernaturalism that Rabbi Menaker alluded to earlier. And yet here is this kid, David, the next generation, and he's postmodern. He can live with multiple inconsistent identities layered one on top of the other. That is to say, in his working life, in his Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 life, he reads the New York Times, lives rationally, abides by science. But when he comes to Shul Shabbos, he becomes a chassid. He wants enchantment. He wants mysticism. He wants religious experience. Why is it that when most Jews today quote somebody, they're quoting Heschel, not Kaplan? They're quoting Heschel, not Kaplan, because they want that kind of mysticism, spirituality, enchantment, imagination, religious experience, expressive religion that Heschel represents, not the rational religion that Kaplan represents. And that's the generational shift that Rabbi Schulweis couldn't abide by. He couldn't figure out what to say. Now, I think, as someone's pointed out both in the comments and in what we've talked about, there are places within Kaplan that one can find. I mean, in the book Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion, read the chapter on Shmini Atzeret. I know that's a little obscure, and I apologize for it. So there's a book called Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion. It's a very awesome book. Read the introduction, but then turn to the chapter on Shmini Atzeret, which is this very obscure holiday in the fall. And he talks about God as a felt presence. Mordecai Kaplan talks about God as a felt presence. And if you want to see the Rashi on that, read Milton Steinberg. Milton Steinberg, who was his Talmid Mufak, and had he lived, this would be a very different discussion today. He died very young. But had Steinberg lived and given us a new Rashi and Tosfos on Kaplan, we would have a very different, because Steinberg, toward the end of his life, became a real theist in ways that Kaplan would have had a lot of trouble with, and it would have been a wonderful, fruitful machloket, right? So what I'm suggesting is that what people are looking for now is something that it isn't quite captured within the Kaplanian aura. Right? They're looking for religious experience. They're looking for emotional expression. They're looking for a sort of poetry. I once asked Harold Kushner of blessed memory to reflect on Kaplan. And he said, Kaplan was so brilliant in his vision, but he had a pen dipped in concrete. There's no poetry there. And that's what people are looking for in religious life. And that, I think, is what Reconstructionism needs to sort of bring back into. And you begin to hear it in certain places. Again, I love that book, The Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion. You can hear it there, but we need to advance that. That's what I would suggest, on top of everything Amy said so beautifully.
Yeah, both of you. So people should know, the greater Kaplan Center community, that there's a class beginning tomorrow night where 25 people, class is filled, are exploring with Rabbi Lee Friedlander and Harriet Feiner Rabbi Ira Eisenstein's translations of Judaism as a Civilization and the Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion, to make that more accessible, to hear those other voices. Also, I mentioned to people that if you go to the Kaplanian Voices section of our website, you will hear a dialogue, an interview really, with Mel Scalt about this very section that Rabbi Feinstein alludes to Shmini Atzeret, coming out of the Meaning of God. And powerfully, he evokes the personal, deep spiritual elements that are there if one looks deeply into Kaplan. Caitlin, you've been following the chat room probably better than I. That's your job today. I thank you for it. Any other comments or questions you want to bring to our attention?
There is one. However, I just want to put in the caveat that it may be divisive. Rabbi Pinsker is wondering if anybody would like to comment on Kaplan Zionism. And I just want to add the addendum that this in and of itself might be a particular sticking point with why people are grieving or having a difficult time right now with either the idea of consolidating movements or even coming to synagogue, particularly if they're younger people. I've noticed it is true, like as Rabbi Bernstein said, there's a lot of things that people can leave at the door. But one thing that I've noticed that people can't seem to leave must leave at the door when they go to synagogue, even in Reconstructionist shuls, is their feelings on what's going on right now in the Middle East. And when people do try to talk about this in a way that doesn't have a particular framing, there's often a very visceral reaction. So maybe it's worth talking about what Kaplan's viewpoint on this is and why maybe sometimes we get stuck and we can't either move beyond it or move in any direction at all with it.
Amy or Ed, either of you?
I think Kaplan, I think, I don't know that Kaplan's Zionism is something that speaks to this so much as it is the times that we're living in, where we are so polarized that we can't talk across certain kinds of differences. So that sometimes that's about Israel, and the other place that is about, of course, political identities, that we have become so attached to our political identities, way more in some cases than our Jewish identity. I'm talking pre-October 7th. That we are unable to have conversation around it. I think people go to this place if their amygdala starts screaming, and so their frontal lobes shut down, and we're no longer having a rational conversation. We're having a conversation rooted in fear and anxiety, and about this fear of the other. And like I said about cancel culture, this whole idea that we can't tolerate somebody having a different opinion about either politics or Israel, because we've become so identified with those positions that we're unable to have a bigger self that's able to have a conversation of them as topics. I know I'm not answering exactly the question, but I think that is a real problem that threatens the Jewish people in a way that we've not had before. Our political divisions. I'm very, very worried about that in the Jewish American culture and society, and I'm very concerned about what the conversation about Israel is doing to us as well, or the inability to have the conversation about Israel, what that's doing to us. And I'm concerned on another level of the parting of Ed and I both were at Hartman. One of the reasons we're at Hartman is because we care a lot about having, not, as Doniel Hartman says, not having the Jewish people walk away from each other on our watch, that, that the Jews of America and the Jews of Israel, we're starting to see some growing in different ways that is really frightening about not that we can't be different, not that we shouldn't be different, but that we are unable, that we're starting to not be able to have a conversation across those differences, and a real association and identification across those differences is very, very worrying. And I think Kaplan would be all about how do we counter that in both American and Jewish culture. What do we do to to address it?
Ed?
The Jewish people suffers from a massive case of collective PTSD. We've been suffering since the Second World War. We never healed. We started to deal with it a little bit, But, you know, in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and as Israel got stronger and was able to defend itself, we began to relax a little bit and let go of some of the residual paranoia that comes from PTSD. And on October 7th, the bus backed over us again. And now we're right back there again. And so every conflict gets dropped into a Manichaean good guys, bad guys, good, evil, God, the devil kind of matrix. And if you step 1 centimeter over the line, you get smashed. And that's what people are coming to shul with today. That's what they're coming to APAC with, or with all the other organizations. There is such paranoia now, and it's going to get worse, because once the initial shock of this now begins to wear off, when the war does, God willing, come to an end, or at least to a lull, a resolution of some sort, then instead of turning on an enemy, we're going to turn on each other. And that's what's going to make this even worse. And it's right now there's a sort of quiet lull, although you got to be very careful what you say. When this resolves, then all the rage and all the helplessness and all of the guilt is going to get projected onto the people around us. And I'm really fearful about what's coming. I'm really fearful about what's coming. That doesn't reflect on Kaplan Zionism. I mean, except to say that, again, to go back to Amy's beautiful articulate point, the idea that we trust the Jewish people to find a moral center was Kaplan's great contribution. And I pray that he's right. I pray that we can find that moral center, that we can listen to each other, that we can build a community that embraces machloket without killing each other. Right, Daniel Hartman's beautiful statement that when the Mishnah, when the Midrash tells us that the Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai argued with each other for 3 years, and finally God came down and said, "Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chaim." They're all the voices of God. The most important part of that sugya is that they argued with each other for 3 years. They didn't reject, they didn't walk away, and they didn't cancel each other, and they didn't kill each other. They stayed in the conversation. That's where moral maturity and moral intelligence lives. But if I can say this without getting everybody pissed off, you know, moral intelligence and moral sensitivity and moral compassion is kind of hard to come by in the Jewish community right now, because the fear and the rage and the pain of this catastrophe has pushed it out.
Well, that's making me speechless, not angry at you at all, Ed. I haven't been all time, but speechless because of the profundity of the challenge. And what I want to do, of course, is to underscore that the Kaplan Center is really dedicated creating dialogues around these tough questions, and we think Kaplan can be informative. If you go to our website, there's a whole set of links to our dialogues over the last 8 months about Kaplan and Zionism and reconstructing his 1954, A New Zionism. And we invite you to join that ongoing conversation. It is so critical. We have a minhag, Ed and Amy. I apologize if I didn't mention this clearly to you. It's an invitation to stay on with us for a bit. Our minhag is that at right about this time, about 3:35, that we lift our ban against staying muted, and we take a few minutes for people to come on, not quite yet, but in a few moments, to raise your hand and to unmute and to respond more personally, where we can panim el panim, we can see your face in response to some of the ideas that have been raised. Before we do that, or as we do that, Sheridan, I would like you to take us to the Kaplan Center website. I know Jane is going to say something about this, but we gave a bit of short shrift to the kind of day that it is and the funeral of an extraordinary Reconstructionist Kaplanian leader, Rabbi Emanuel Goldsmith. We have resources here, reflections from his family, from Nell Scult, from a number of different people. And we like people to know that this is up. You can click the folder, and that we have an ongoing commitment the Kaplan Center does to publishing some of the tributes and some of Manny Goldsmith's articles about Judaism and democracy in relationship to our partnership with the Jewish Partnership for Democracy, a More Perfect Union. We have a grant to share Kaplanian insights, and we're going to add those of Manny Goldsmith to it. So this whole dialogue has been dedicated to the memory of this very precious and funny, I learned at his funeral earlier today, extraordinary person. He probably would share with us from his Yiddish background. He's a Yiddish scholar. Man tracht and Gott lacht. Man plans, God laughs, and boy, is that the age we're looking in. So let's hope we can glean some real laughter from that cosmic laugh to us. And Jane, you're not Lisa, we know that, but we know who you are. Would you have your hand raised very dutifully? Would you like to say something about Manny Goldsmith or something else, and then we'll open it up to others as well?
With me in the list of things that I was talking about and in our introduction, I neglected, I think, to mention that we are dedicating this wonderful, provocative webinar to Manny's memory. I have the pleasure of knowing him a little bit. I spent several times in his home talking about Kaplan and attended his services and heard him introduce 2-3 new melodies for every service. It was wonderful. And when you watch the YouTube there's a YouTube about a speech that he gave. I mean, he was really funny. In addition to being learned, he was a really funny man, and we all miss him. So
already.
Yes,
Thank
absolutely.
you.
And I think we'll be able to put the video of the funeral with all those family remembrances on the website as soon as we get it.
That is our intent for sure. Caitlin, I think we went through most of the questions. Do you have, are we good with that? Can we now open it up per our minhag to anyone who'd like to raise their hand? We'll immediately recognize you and give you a chance to process the depth of wisdom that we've been exposed to through Rabbis Feinstein and Bernstein today in the form of a question or even just a comment. So please,
we are all good. And Daniel Musher has a question.
I just want to comment. Thank you. It's a fascinating conversation. Mordecai Kaplan was my grandfather. We were very close. And I happen to agree that the meaning of God is his most understandable and accessible book, tells most about him. I just want to say that in addition, I think he would not have liked the term Kaplanian. So I wish all of you would think about that. I just don't think he would have liked that. Mordecai Kaplan said, or I think Mordecai Kaplan thought, or whatever Mordecai Kaplan wrote, but I don't think he would like Kaplanian.
Okay. Can you say more why, Daniel? It's a very important point. Expound a little bit. Why wouldn't he like that?
Well, as I think it was you, but somebody has pointed out, he didn't want to be the father of another denomination. And some of you may know that our daughter, Deborah, did her honors thesis at Princeton on the idea of Reconstructionism as a separate movement. And she studied his diaries and showed, I think, quite convincingly what my understanding is he didn't want it to be. And it was his students, particularly my uncle Ira, who was interested in having it be a separate movement. So I don't think he would like the term. And I don't think he liked dividing things up. I think, none of you has mentioned his concept of a Jewish constitution. He wanted a new constitution of the Jewish people. In fact, he burned with that concept. Same thing. I love the use of the word God intoxicated. I'm so glad that you did that, because he burned with zeal for the Jewish people.
Yeah.
And
Right.
I just don't think he liked fragmentation, and I don't think he would like Kaplanian.
You're right. I'm sure, Daniel, at Manny Goldsmith's funeral this morning, there were stories told, and one of them was about the 1967 convention, where the decision had to be made whether we're going to found a rabbinical school, number one, and number two, become a movement. And there were a number of people who thought it's enough to keep doing the Reconstructionist magazine, and we should be a platform for thought. And then he rallied the troops against that, according to what I've now learned, saying we'll never survive. Things like, people don't give money to an idea, they give it to a movement. And even more, Kaplan needs disciples who are taken through a rabbinical college. And that was Manny's point of view, but it's contestable, as Daniel teaches us. Anyone else want to jump in? I think I really ought to turn to Steve and Avi. They were kind enough to help frame it and begin, and see if either of them would like to make a comment. We always learn from the vice president of the Kaplan Center, Eric Kaplan, though he knows the virtue of silence as well, so maybe he doesn't want to jump in here. But I do want to give Avi and Steve a chance to share as we begin to move towards closure, as well as other people. So Avi or Steve, we'll give you first opportunity if something's rattling around that you'd like to share. Steve? You're muted still, Steve.
Okay, I think I got rid of that thing. Okay, Avi, do you want to go first? I'm glad to go first if you don't want to go first. I'm just throwing it at you.
Look, Alphonse, just go. Go, Steve.
All right, well, look, I think there's a real misunderstanding, as I've studied Judaism over the decades, that there was ever any kind of unification of who we are. I mean, we've always been split up by countries, by ideas, by, Rabbinic Judaism, Karaite Judaism, Sumerian Judaism. I mean, wherever you go in history, and in some countries, we didn't really talk to each other. You go back to if you go back to biblical times, you could be talking about Baalites. I mean, they probably saw themselves as Jews. It was just that the tradition didn't see them as Jews. And, I think there's I don't think that there's going to ever be I think by the nature of Judaism, there are going to be major different movements, and it's not a singular thing. It's, I've been involved in a lot of interfaith work most of my life, and I see interfaith people trying to put themselves together, but I'm always laughing because I've never thought the Jews put themselves together. So I don't even know why we would think that Kaplanian Judaism is going to be the place where Judaism finds a singular place to be, or even 50 singular places to be. I think it's important to come up with and I'm haven't done it, so I won't brag. I've written it down or anything, but I don't think that's a Judaism that's going to work. And I think you're going to find a lot of Jews and Christians doing things together too. And like in the years ahead, I don't, the small towns, you can see that they're in the same building and they're starting to do things in the same place. And I think we're looking for something that isn't doable. And we always will, but I don't think we should. I think we should look for a way for varied people with very different things to work in the same world of faith and figure out how to make that work together. And I don't think we do that.
Thank you, Steve. Avi?
Yeah, I want to just comment about a couple of things. I think one of the differences between, there was a mention about postmodernity versus modernity, and I think one of the differences is that in modernity, you were either a rationalist or you were a spiritualist. You were a rationalist or you were a mystic, and you weren't necessarily both. Many people have said that Maimonides was in fact both, despite the fact that we call him a rationalist. But in the modern world, usually you were forced to choose. And I think in today's world, and I certainly see it in myself, that is not the case. I am a total rationalist, and I completely believe in the spiritual aspect and the emotional aspect of Judaism as absolutely as important, not in second place at all. And I don't think I'm alone. I think that that is an incredible amount of a number of people. The thing I do fear sometimes is that the rational gets lost in the enthusiasm of the spiritual. And I think that that's not necessary. I think that, and that's not healthy either. I think that the two really can coexist together in real harmony, and that that the spiritual aspects of Judaism and the emotional aspects of Judaism are actually enhanced by rationalism. They're actually enhanced by it. And I think that that is a stage that we could move into. And that would also be, I hope, more trans-denominational. I'm not sure we can ever get to post-denominational. I get Steve just now talking about the fact that we've always had a lot of divisions. But again, I think that we're in a new phase in terms of whether or not you have to make these kinds of choices and whether or not there's some room for synthesis in our Jewish expression.
This very same Rabbi Avi Winokur, who you just heard from now, put in the chat room a program, actually, based on what he said: reject the irrational, require the rational, encourage the irrational. Interesting program. Anyone else like to raise their hand, come on, and share a response to the issues that have been raised or to the webinar as a whole? We always hope that you find it stimulating.
I just want to say that I misspoke if I suggested in any way that I think it's going to be monolithic, or should be. Like I just want to clarify that, and then to say also that, like, the beauty of Mordecai Kaplan is that we get to say we're Kaplanian if we want to say that, because Mordecai Kaplan believed we should be able to articulate things the way we need to, and he trusted us to do that. And even if he didn't like it shining back on him or whatever, and I know he didn't want to divide the Jewish people further, but I'm going to say I'm a Kaplanian because that's what he enabled us to do, is to be able to claim that proudly as a way to kind of just communicate a little bit about who we are, Hamivin Yavi. And I know, like, you have to know his stuff to know what that means. But for those of us, sometimes it's really meaningful to say that. And sometimes it's so I can differentiate myself from some of my colleagues who reject the anti-supernaturalism of Kaplan. And so in some ways I use that as a way to kind of identify myself within the stream of even Reconstructionist Judaism.
Amy, thank you. I don't see any other questions. Caitlin.
I have a comment.
question.
Yes, I actually
Okay.
really want to challenge Orthodox Kaplanians about this idea that Judaism being quote unquote pre-reconstructed, or Judaism, the way that it's being reconstructed, is moving further away from Mordecai Kaplan. I think, like, I understand the anxiety, and I understand why people would feel very strongly about that and be so concerned about it. But at the same time, sociologically, Judaism is always evolving. This is like a tenet that Kaplan himself even says. We can't run from it. We know that it's always going to be changing, in the same way that we can't go back from a pre-Maimonidean world. And we can't say, oh, geez, I wish people would go back to the roots of Maimonides and read it in Arabic and understand it from the start. We're not necessarily going to be able to have that luxury with Reconstructionism and with some of the source texts that we want people to understand. And so I think that we just have to be grateful for the fact that there are people who are willing to reinterpret these texts and change the way that they allow people to study them. There's actually a lot of beautiful young people who are creating new ways to explore texts and pursue them. And I think that sometimes we're just not able to see that because they're not in our purview. And I also just think that it's hard sometimes to know what the future will look like because we're currently in a state of a lot of grief and despair. And so I think that we just have to have hope that just like we still have Judaism post-Holocaust, we will still have Judaism post-October 7th.
Caitlin and I are good friends, so we can engage in a friendly machloket, a difference of perspective. I agree with what you're saying, Caitlin, but I actually read the comment in the chat room differently. I read it to mean that people often go to congregations where it's already set the parameters of what Kaplan is, what Reconstructionism is, so they never have a chance to dig in and actually go through that process themselves and be critical and reconstruct Judaism because it's been pre-reconstructed. So, but I would agree with your larger point. And I see that Carol Richmond, hello, Carol Richmond, I haven't seen you in a long, long time, has her hand raised. So please share your thought.
This is so mundane compared to all of the brilliant comments that everybody knows and does. But I referred in the comments to Cheryl Lewert, 20 some odd years ago, wrote a curriculum called Jewish Alive in American. Fabulous curriculum, lousy title. And for the last 20 years, I have been teaching that curriculum. The fact that it's been 20 years tells you that there is such, at least we experience at University Synagogue in Irvine, California, we experience just a rush of people each year coming in begging to understand at least my interpretation of a rational Judaism. And I am forever a devotee of Kaplan because he gives me the ability, the language, the concepts to talk about our most mundane to most spiritual high understandings of what Judaism is and who we are as a people and why you should or should not be Jewish or Jewish adjacent and all of that kind of stuff. And so I just want to say to those of you who absolutely know it anyway, that this tiny little curriculum has been wildly important for hundreds of people in our area to educate, to have them cleave to have them go to a Hillel or a college campus when they go, and before they have a baby, and as they marry, and all of those things. So I just want to give credit where credit is due, or state the obvious, that this is really important stuff for us to do. This ground level educational stuff creates the next generation and the next generation. The end. Amen.
And Eric has his hand raised. Eric?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think that, getting to the, to the question of our basic relationship to Mordecai Kaplan, I personally see Kaplan as a resource. I don't see Kaplan as a religion. Maybe that ties in with what Daniel's saying about Kaplanian. But I think the tricky thing when we're dealing in a pluralistic environment, which I, of course, endorse wholeheartedly, is to read the various people who we are looking to for inspiration in a deep and honest way. And I think the major difference between Kaplan and Heschel on some of the issues that we're talking about is that Heschel is much more focused on nature than Kaplan is. Kaplan says, certain, maybe advanced spiritual people might be able to experience God in nature, but for most of us, we will experience God in community, right? And the fact that Heschel has a lot to say about experiencing God in nature, responding to the natural world with radical amazement, with awe and wonder, makes him more in line with, some of the ways that people like to, interact with the world and speak about it. But at the same time, when you dive deeply into Heschel, you recognize his strong belief in a personal God. And for me, he also has to be a resource, because I can't, as a liberal Jew, endorse him, embrace him either completely, because there's just too many aspects of the way he perceives God, or the way he perceives the world, that I can't connect with. So I think whatever, thinker we're looking at, whatever religious movement we're looking at, I think it's incumbent upon us to read them carefully and in a holistic manner, because if not, we're not really in a position to talk about the difference between X and Y and say that this person doesn't say this, or doesn't, or may not say this. And that's not a simple task. It's really not a simple task. But we're talking about Kaplan and his relationship to lay leadership. As I put in the chat, he had a very problematic relationship to lay leadership, right? When the members of his synagogue didn't want him to take off Kol Nidre, he didn't necessarily think he had to listen to them. So I think on all of these issues, we just have to, we have to do the work.
Thank you, Eric. I have a responsibility to make sure that we rarely, if ever, go beyond 5 o'clock Eastern time for our webinar, because it's just respectful of your time and your commitments. So I do want to go through some thank yous, and I want to give you an opportunity. I mean, this is one of the limitations of Zoom, but it's not really limited. You have a reaction button. If you felt stimulated, challenged, even as my wife says, she whispered to me, she came over, deeply challenged, stimulated, and a little sad because these issues are so heavy. But if you felt stimulated and engaged, asok b'divrei Torah, would you click on your reaction button and raise your hand to let you know that your mind has been challenged and you've gained some new insights this afternoon? So I'm going to make sure I do that. And I'm guessing it's a little bit of bias, but I'm guessing that if someone hasn't do it, it's because they're trying to master the technology. I think I speak for everyone in thanking particularly Ed and Amy for deep thought. I know even preparing for this with them was a matter of some depth and originality of thought. So we thank them so much for doing that, and you've really been our pleasure, and you've moved us to think many, many new things. And I hope it's been valuable for you. I know for us, it fulfilled our purposes. I can see from all the hands going up. I do also want to thank, as we end, Caitlin, who is our Balat She'elot, our master of questions. Few people follow a chat room as well as Caitlin does. And thank you to Sheridan for being our Zoom Gabbai, for Jane for her introductions, and to both Avi and Ed, he doubled, and Steve Gutal for their introductory remarks. So be well. In honor of Manny Goldsmith, we would say sei gesund. Do well, enjoy yourself, find a way to do that even with the tough issues, and with that Yiddish saying. Okay, I'm going to close the webinar and thank people for all that they offered.
Take
Thank
care,
you.
Jeff. Thank you.
Hey,
Thanks a lot.
hey,
You all.
okay, thank you, everyone.
Bye.